Welcome to the podcast, Take a Deep Breath with Us. I'm your host, Dr. Ginnelle Ries. After being a physician for many years, I felt it was important to spread the message that this life is not the end and miracles do happen. I spread this message of hope not only by sharing my own stories, but those of my guests, who share their incredible stories of such things as angelic encounters, near-death experiences, miraculous healings, and unexplained spiritual events. Thank you for joining us. Hi, welcome to this episode of Take a Deep Breath with Us. I'm your host, Dr. Ginnelle Ries. I've told my kids over the years that street drugs are the devil's candy. When I'd say this to them, they'd laugh, they'd say I'm being dramatic. But really, I don't think there's a listener or a viewer out there that hasn't been touched by the negative effects of drug use, abuse, or addiction. In fact, I don't think there's many things on this earth that have drawn so many tears as drugs in our society. So when you're in the clutches of the devil's candy, what I would call the big lie, sometimes you need the power of God, or I would say oftentimes you need the power of God to get you out. Well, my guest today, Pete Douglas, is going to tell you such a story. God revealed himself to Pete and called him not once, not twice, but multiple times. And thank goodness Pete answered that call. And he attributes that to saving his life. And since that time, Pete has been a witness, sharing his story throughout his many years. So thank you so much for being here. The audience is going to really appreciate your incredible story. So,
sure thing. Yes, glad to be here.
Well, I was just going to say, why don't you take us back to, your early life, or when this all began? What drew you into that lifestyle, and how did that happen?
Yeah, I think it's such a typical story for most people. Just a search for identity, a search for meaning, a search for significance. We're all put here for a purpose, but that's kind of vague. And so, what am I really here for? What's life all about? That whole thing. So, growing up as a child, I grew up in a loving home. It was a kind of an unusual situation. My father and mother were 22 years difference in their ages, and so at around the age of 8, my father was 62. He was 54 when I was born, and he had some kind of a major health episode, like a heart attack thing or something, And so anyway, he was kind of a semi-invalid from then on. And during that time, I was in parochial schools. I was raised in the Catholic Church and went all through Catholic grade schools. And, growing up, I just began to be very searching, what is life about? What am I here for? And all that whole thing. And as a child, I believed in God and I believed in Jesus. And but Jesus to me in those years was like a historical figure, like Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or somebody. It was just like a person who appeared in history. And I never dreamed or thought of such a thing as being able to have a relationship with him. So I was just wandering. I was just loose and wandering. And then as I got older and got into adolescence and got into sin, one thing I had never heard of or really understood at all was grace, that God would give me grace to help me go through these things. So to me, it was a religious concept. To me, it was just like I was supposed to do certain things and I wasn't supposed to do other things. And the things that I wasn't supposed to do were all the things that I wanted to do, like everybody.
Right, like most adolescents.
So, I just had no power to resist these temptations, seemingly, or didn't understand how to tap into it. So I just let go and said, well, if I'm going to go into sin, I want to do it all the way. So I just
You're
went.
a perfectionist in sin.
all or nothing, all or nothing. So I just went headlong into sin and just gave up on the whole religious thing. My conscience was always guilty. I was always bothered by I shouldn't be doing these things. And so, in the Bible it says there are people who seared their conscience. And so like scalding something so many times that you no longer have feeling. So that's what you can do as a young person. You can pursue sin to such a degree that you can just kill your conscience almost, and you no longer feel bad about the things that you're doing. And so that's really what I did, is I just pursued sin and overrode my conscience to such a degree that I just no longer believed in God, didn't care what I did, really only cared about myself. At that time I got drafted. I was sent to Vietnam. But still, with all of that, I was not, it had anything to do with drugs. I was into sports. In fact, looking at me now as a 77-year-old man, it's hard to believe, but at that time I was into weightlifting, feats of strength, arm wrestling, competition sports, and all of that. So drugs to me was just like for losers, misfits. It was not on my radar at all. But in Vietnam, while I was over there, it was very lonely, dangerous, and the people that I hung out with and the music that we all liked just went that direction. So I started smoking marijuana. It's interesting that you said today is National, what is it? National.
Right, it's 4/20 today, okay. April 20th, and it's the non-official marijuana holiday.
So how interesting. So how ironic and perhaps not coincidental.
Right.
Because, I got involved in marijuana as the opening door towards bigger and better, harder drugs. And it's really kind of a little funny story. So these friends of mine says, you got to smoke some dope with us. I was like, no, I don't want that stuff, So they said, okay. So they kind of left me alone. So one night they came up and got me and they said, we want you to come down and look at something in the motor pool where they kept all the Jeeps and stuff. So I said, well, what's going on down there? Well, come on, you got to check it out. So I went down with them. It was all people that we hung around with and had fun with. So they said, check out this trailer. So I looked in this trailer and they said, it's in the back. So I got up and I went in the back of this trailer and they all got in and pulled the flap down on this trailer and they all started lit up smoking marijuana cigarettes. And I didn't even smoke, so I didn't know how to inhale or anything. So just sitting in there, breathing the smoke, I got high.
So that was your first
That was
experience.
my first introduction. And they said, well, how is it? Are you getting anything? And I said, no, I'm not. And we were all laughing, and I was starting to get really hungry. And so they said, no, you're not getting anything. I said, no. So we got out of the trailer, and when I stepped out, I felt like I was stepping out onto the craters of the moon, and the ground just looked weird. So the reason why marijuana is dangerous is because it's so much fun. You have so much fun. You're laughing, you're hungry, you're munching. It's great, but it's a trap. You don't realize that you're being led into something that can be something you can't control.
Right.
So,
and I was just going to say, I think that's what, kids probably think. They think, how could something so fun be dangerous?
Exactly.
This is just fun. We're not doing anything bad. Nothing bad can happen because of this.
Actually, it was the time of your life.
Yes.
It was amazing fun. But the problem is that it's an escape from reality, and then when you come back, you can't wait to escape again. So that's, eventually what happened. So long story short, I got more and more into marijuana, then hashish, then, opium, various different kinds of drugs. And then when we got back to the United States after the military, the marijuana here was much weaker. got involved with a pusher. He got me involved with harder drugs, started taking this drug called MDA, which was, from what I understand now, it's similar to what the kids call ecstasy. So, got further and further into that drug scene, and with the music, was a real big fan of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, The Doors, all these people. So, but, back here on drugs, never intending to go that way, never intending to, it's like it takes you further than you ever wanted to go and keeps you longer than you ever wanted to stay. So getting more and more involved in all that, eventually I was, even though I was asleep, in a sense, I began waking up to the realization that I was in serious trouble.
You began waking up to the realization?
I began waking up to the realization that I was in serious trouble.
And how old were you when?
27.
So you were 27.
I was 27.
So you had been doing drugs for how long at this point?
See, I got drafted and went to Vietnam quite late. So I was 24 when I was drafted, and I got out of the Army when I was 26. So during those years is when I was beginning to be immersed into the drug culture.
And, I think just sitting here listening to you, Pete, you're 77 years old, but yet the things you're saying are the same things that young people today who are maybe starting out with drugs, the same feelings, the same thoughts. I'm just having fun with my friends. We're chilling. Nothing's going to happen because of this. And oftentimes by the time they do get a sense that maybe something is a little out of control here, it's often too late.
Absolutely. Right there is where I would like to bring an element in, and that is that, drugs opens a doorway into a realm that is real, and I call it the spiritual realm. There's a term called pharmakia, which is a Greek thing for, drugs. So these drugs, I was doing hallucinogenic drugs, I was doing LSD, I was doing this ecstasy type drug that was cut with heroin or cut with cocaine. These drugs open a door into the realm of spiritual things, which is invisible to our natural eye. And in that place is where demons live. And if God is real, the devil is real. And so you call it the devil's candy. So in that realm, they gain access to you on legal ground because you're trespassing someplace you don't belong. I had a friend who came to me and he said, "Would you talk to my brother? He's doing drugs." So I talked to his brother, and he said, "No one has ever told me that the experiences that I've had were real because I know they're real." He said, "Everybody tries to tell me, no, he said, "No, it's real." And I said, "It's absolutely real, but you're entering into a place where you're exposed to danger and you're there illegally and your life is at risk." And so many people never get to be 77 years old to tell this story. And I am so thankful to be here. So as I entered into this realm and became more and more susceptible to all this demonic, I was having hallucinations and nightmares and all kinds of stuff, knew I was in trouble and began to start praying as I did when I was a child. But I was so far off, I didn't even know that God was real. So I would say prayers like, "God, if you're real, I need you to help me." And "Jesus, if you're real, I need to know it. I need help."
Were you asking for help to stop the drugs or asking for help to not have these scary thoughts or hallucinations, or what were you actually asking help for?
All of the above. All of the above. Just knew I was in trouble. There's an old saying, like you got a monkey on your back. Well, that monkey was a devil that had a hold of me and was taking me to a premature death to destroy my life. And I couldn't get free from it. I couldn't get free from the addiction. I knew that I just wanted to escape and be in that place of calm and peace. But then when you'd come back to reality, it would be that much worse. And so I knew I needed help. So I began to cry out for help. And this is where it gets really interesting because, as I mentioned, the Bible, see, I didn't believe, and I thought you had to believe. But the Bible says, and I didn't know this, but the Bible says faith is the evidence of things hoped for in the book of Hebrews. And so God began answering my prayers for help, but I didn't understand the answer. The answer was he began giving me evidence. So all these miraculous coincidences began happening. So for an example, you ask how old I was. I was 27 years old at this time. And there's a story about what's called the 27 Club. So there were 6 rock musicians, and they all died at age 27. It's Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison of the Doors was the world's #1 band in the late 60s.
Right.
More recently, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse. There was Brian Jones, who actually founded the Rolling Stones. All of these people died at age 27. And 2 of these people died on the 3rd of July, and that's my birthday. So it's like evidence, incredible amounts of evidence kept coming. And these things were causing me to realize that something was going on. For instance, I was in a park on Easter Sunday morning in 1972, in March, I think it was. And they were playing the rock music of our time over the speakers. And there were people walking around doing drugs. It was in Volker Park across from the Rock Hill Nelson Art Gallery. And it was a big hangout for the hippies. This was during what they call the Jesus People movement, the hippies,
Right.
the late 60s, early 70s. This music was playing, and some teenagers came over to me, and they walked up to me and said, we want to tell you about Jesus Christ. I had just gotten home from Vietnam not too long before that. I was on drugs at the time. I started cursing, using foul language, and saying, I don't want to hear that stuff. I don't want to hear that stuff. You guys, I don't need that. That's a crutch. You know, I was on drugs. I didn't think that was a crutch.
Right.
It was my crutch. But so I started cursing, and as they were talking to me, 2 dogs were there. And I guess there weren't leash laws at the time. There were 2 big, good-sized dogs. And they get in a dog fight while these guys are trying to talk to me. And these dogs were snarling, trying to tear each other's throat. It was a vicious, vicious dog fight. And I was on speed and a bunch of stuff. And I was, reacting to all this stuff that was going on. And why I did this, I'll never know, but I turned to the teenagers and I said, listen, I said, if your God is so real, why don't you tell him to stop these dogs from fighting?
So I can hear you, didn't you say?
Yeah, so I can hear you. And they just immediately turned away and said this little Sunday school type prayer, simple little childlike prayer. They said, dear God, please stop the dogs from fighting so we can tell this man about Jesus. Instantly, the dogs stopped fighting, instantly. And this peace just came down over this thing. And I had 2 friends with me at the time. And we all looked at each other like, what just happened? We don't have a grid for this, what just happened? And we were very shaken. But this is an important part of the story. It's the cartoon where you have the little red guy on one shoulder and the white guy playing the harp with the wings on the other shoulder.
Right.
And the little red guy has the pitchfork. And he was screaming at me and saying, Pete, it's the drugs. These things just happen. If all the dogs were in the world and any certain day, 2 of them would stop fighting. I was like, oh, probably so. I couldn't reconcile what just happened.
Right.
So I left from there, having seen this miraculous experience and still not ready to give up. So then I had this, talking about evidence. I was in a room that I had made for drugs in my basement of my house. And I had blacklight posters and all these lights, and I had a music synthesizer, and I had it hooked up to a tape recorder with Jimi Hendrix playing his music. And as the music would play, the lights would flash in sequence with the music, and it was just a whole psychedelic thing. And I was doing drugs with this friend of mine who's my brother-in-law, who's since passed away. But anyway, Mike and I were doing drugs, and we were staring at a blacklight poster while we were doing the drugs. And this blacklight poster was a picture of a woods with a path that went down through it. And it was like an endless path. As it went into the woods, it disappeared like a ribbon, and you could just see that the path disappeared. And as we talked together, like you and I are talking, we had a mental telepathy on these drugs that was just instantaneous. I looked at his eyes and he looked at mine, like, are you experiencing what I'm experiencing? And we were both completely aware that we were experiencing the same thing. And we were both walking on this path. So the experience came to life. It was no longer a picture with us sitting in chairs like this looking at but it came to life.
It was reality.
It was reality. And we were walking on this path together, going down into this woods. And I looked back at him, and suddenly he was gone. He disappeared. And I just felt compelled to continue walking this path. So I continued down this path, and I came out into a clearing. And in this clearing, it was dimly lit, but you could begin to see a little bit. Like it's 8 o'clock at night or something, and there's a little bit of ambient light. There in front of me was a pit stretched out in front of me, covered over with a vapor. And people's hands were reaching out of the pit. And I didn't know that there's a pit described in the Bible, but at that time I didn't know that. And so I saw this pit, and as I looked, a figure came from the right and a figure came from the left. These were like maybe 8 feet tall, 7, 8 feet tall, huge beings wearing cloaks like the Grim Reaper. You could not see their faces. The cloaks covered them, like you could just see dark in there. They were huge figures, beings. One of them took me on the right, and I was a strong guy. One of them took me on the right arm, one of them took me on the left arm, and they were going to throw me in the pit. And I could not say a word in my defense. Everything about my life was totally exposed. I mean, any sin, anything, any attitude, everything was open and exposed and laid bare. There was no defense. I was completely exposed, and I knew that I belonged in that pit, and they were going to throw me in. And as they began to throw me in, a voice split the night, pitch dark above me. You couldn't see above how high it went. A voice split that darkness, and a lightning bolt flashed like this. And the voice was in perfect sequence, speaking out of the lightning bolt, and called my name and said, "Pete." The lightning splitting, and said, "If I give you another chance, will you take it?" And I said, "Oh, yes, yes, yes." Instantly, I was back in my chair. I mean, it's just like this chair. Instantly, I was back in my chair in my room with my brother-in-law, totally sober, drugs gone, instantly wide awake, totally sober, in shock, looking at each other like, what just happened? And the red guy screams again and says, "It's the drugs, it's the drugs. These things, you don't do anything radical. You're an all or nothing person, don't, just relax, it's the drugs." And I mean, again, I listened to it.
Can I ask?
Absolutely.
So, a couple questions, just listening to this incredible story, some thoughts, a couple questions. When you saw the pit and the arms were sticking out, and I think, was there, because I had kind of read your story before, that like people moaning and there was agony, and you knew that these beings were caught in this pit in the agony.
Very important part. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because the feeling of hopelessness was beyond all comprehension that was there. And to discover the reality of that, many years later, I visited a friend of ours who got caught in some kind of a confidence game or something. It was sentenced to some time in Leavenworth Penitentiary. And we went there to visit him. And when we went in through the many sets of bars and searches, we got inside the prison and we went into this visiting room. And I felt it again. It was people who were doing 60-year sentences, life in prison without parole, broken dreams, broken homes, broken families, never going to see their kids on the outside again. In this little visiting room where convicts were getting occasional visits from someone, I felt that again. And that's what I felt at that pit. I'd never felt that before. And then when I came back from that, hearing that voice say it's just the drugs, and not knowing what to do, how to reconcile what is reality, go ahead.
Well, and just another thought, and I don't know if you've read or listened to very many near-death experiences, but the story is basically a near-death experience, extremely similar to what so many people have experienced. And most people have a good near-death experience, but there are some that have a negative near-death experience. Right. But the same elements, that what they call the life review, where your whole life is laid out before you, right. and it's the truth. There's no denying. It's out there for everyone to see, and in your heart, this is true, I've done this, or I've been good, I've been bad, and whatever. So it's very interesting that was laid bare for you to see, and you knew that I belong in that pit based on how my life has been at this. And then God coming to save you. So many of the near-death experiences, the same thing, the light coming or a hand coming down, and they know that's the hand of God, or they know it's God, and that so then here God speaks to you. It's just incredible. And then when you came back, I guess the other thing that I'm just so questioning, so did you and your brother-in-law sit there and go, did you talk about it, or were you both just so traumatized that you knew you had the same experience but you didn't talk about it? Or
we didn't talk about it. We were just, as the culture says today, blown away. I mean, we were just blown away. And I was trying to regain my equilibrium of sanity and trying to decide what is reality. And so that's when you're really vulnerable, when you're trying to decide what is reality. That's what people are searching, searching what is reality. And as I was on that search anyway for what is reality, what is identity, what is my purpose, I couldn't have articulated those things, but many people who are doing drugs and many people who are searching in life, whether they're doing drugs or alcohol or workaholic or a sportsaholic or whatever kind of a holic, were searching, and I was on that search. And in my search, I was trying to determine what reality really was. And so when I had this experience, you're so vulnerable in that place, and the devil's saying, and I was used to listening to the devil, not realizing it, and saying, it's just the drugs, you gotta be calm, just take it easy, don't
believe that. Or
it's just be cool. So I grabbed a hold of that again to maintain my balance and equilibrium. So the final episode here, getting to the punchline. So a few months after that, about 3 months later, I was on my job in an electronics plant where I worked. I worked in this electronics plant, and I had a quality control job, so I had a desk, not an office, but just a desk in a big area. And I was walking down the aisle of this job towards my desk, and I heard a voice. Now he's hearing voices. But so I heard a voice, and it was the same voice that I had heard at the pit. And I wasn't fully conscious of all of this, but this is what was going on. So I hear this voice, and the voice says, Pete. I mean, it's your own thoughts. So it's not like
not like hearing a voice with your ear.
Right.
It's an internal voice.
It's an internal voice. So I hear this voice, and it says my name. But I knew it didn't really originate. It wasn't me saying my own name, but it sounded like my own voice just saying Pete. And I heard the voice say Pete in my thoughts. And it arrested me. I was walking down the aisle. And I just began to really pay attention. And it said, you've been stalling. The voice said, you've been stalling for I just had my 28th birthday at this moment, just like 2 weeks prior to this. I just passed the 27 club and entered my 28th year. So I'm 2 weeks into my 28th year and regularly doing drugs. And the voice says, you've been stalling for 28 years. You have to choose. And I snapped back with an answer. And I said, what of people in Africa who've never heard of Jesus Christ? I mean, that was my last argument. And the voice said very calmly, but very authoritatively, Pete, for them that might be an excuse, but you've heard of him. And I was just so shocked because I thought, what's going on? I wouldn't answer my own argument. I'm looking for a way out. What's going on here? So I walked over to my desk and I stood there, and there were people in the area, but they were kind of like off in the distance. And it was a moment in time where it was like just my moment. It was like frozen in time. And all of a sudden I started having this experience like I was in a court of law. And man, did I learn how things work in reality. I began to have this experience like I was in a court of law. And I was standing behind my desk, and it became like the judge's bench. And the prosecuting attorney began to present the evidence. Well, you prayed for a sign and this happened. You said if God would do this, you'd believe. What about the day in the park when the dog stopped fighting? What about the time at the pit? So all these events began to pass in front of my eyes in very orderly sequence, exactly and I was uneducated. I didn't know about court proceedings. I didn't know about law. I lived it, man. I just lived it. And all this evidence began to be presented. And what happened was, and I knew none of this, what happened was it became insurmountable evidence. I don't even think I knew that term. It became conclusive evidence. And when the evidence is conclusive and reaches the place of becoming insurmountable evidence, it demands a verdict. And at that moment, when it was totally conclusive, I said the words, guilty. Then my mind clicked in and realized I'm the one who's guilty, because I said God doesn't exist, or he doesn't care, or whatever, I'm the one who's guilty. And so at that moment, I just said, God, I have made such a mess of my life. I've been married and divorced. I've been on drugs. I've lied, cheated, stolen. I've made such a mess of my life. I said, if you'll give me another chance, I'll live for you. I'll work for you. I'll do whatever you want me to do. And I just surrendered right then and there, like stick 'em up. I just surrendered. When I did, this is leading up to really the miracle that happened. When I did, it's like a backpack that I had on my shoulders was full of, like the kids carry heavy books to school, this backpack was full of bricks, which were sin. Anger, lust, resentment, stealing. All these things were these bricks in this backpack. And the whole thing just slid off my back. The whole thing just slid off my back. All these elements of my sin. And suddenly I just had this overwhelming peace. I mean, it transcended any peace that you ever got on the greatest high. of drugs that you were ever on. It was a deeper, more profound, perfect peace I just couldn't imagine. And so I stood there shaking my head thinking, this is real. This is real. This is not. And so I thought, I'm just going to go in this back room and just consider what's just happened to me. So there was a back room where they made boxes, and it was empty. People were in there. So I went in this back room, and I was pondering what this experience that I just happened. And all of a sudden, and it makes me think of this light over here. All of a sudden, about the same distance, I guess, above me as the voice that split the night with the lightning bolt, all of a sudden this light comes on, whoosh, like this, like a flying saucer light. I mean, there was literally a movie made with Richard Dreyfuss called Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
I remember that.
Okay, so this movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, he is on a lonely road looking for the power outage. He's a lineman. And the flying saucer is perfectly silent, and it's like a block in diameter, and it's sitting on top of him, and he doesn't know it. And the light comes on, and it like almost lifts him out of his seat. That's what happened to me. Only that movie was made years after this happened, so I'd never seen the movie.
Right.
This light comes on, and it's a light that doesn't go around you like natural light. It goes completely through me. Every fiber, every cell, every atom, this light goes completely through me. And my hands go up in the light like this. And I said, Father, my Father. My natural mind began to kick in and said, what are you talking about? Your father's dead. My father had died years before this. And I just said, Father, my Father. And I'm in this light. And then it shuts off. And I'm standing there, and a window opens in the middle of the air. I'm getting weird on you now. A window opens in the middle of the air. I mean, just like you're looking and here's air between us and the wall. A window opens right in the middle of the air. And I look in, and a lot of people, you being a doctor will understand this. You know what an electroencephalograph is?
Right.
Where they plug,
Yes.
electrodes to your brain, watch brain waves, and they show up on the screen. You don't see into the brain, but the screen, exposes what's going on inside your mind, and you see all these traveling like electromagnetic energy traveling through the brain,
Right.
and going off. So this window opens up, and I see inside this window that this, which I already kind of knew, but this is not all there is. There's a reality behind the scenes that we don't see with our natural eyes. And inside this window, I see all these traveling beams of light, like these impulses you'd see on an electroencephalograph. And instantly, I had the understanding that that was a billion, not a million, a billion lives that God was reaching out to touch, simultaneously bringing people to an experience with Himself. Infinite variety. My experience happened to me. This is one thing I want to really emphasize. My experience happened to me because I was one of the worst people that you could ever call to walk with God. I told people about this experience that I worked with, and one guy said, Douglas, my last name, he said, if I was making a list of 1,000 people who were going to give their lives to Jesus Christ, he said, you wouldn't have been on the list.
You wouldn't have been last. You wouldn't even been on the list.
You wouldn't have been on the list. We all laughed, because in the Bible it says God has chosen the base things of this world to confound the wise. So my story is given to give hope to people. There's very few people who were as bad as I was. I mean, I just was a bad person. But this happened to me to give hope to people, to ordinary people.
So when you were telling your story, that last part where, you finally said, you came to the realization, the evidence that God exists and you chose God, and you said all that weight and all that heaviness and sin fell off your back. I'm sitting over here trying not to just, I was getting emotional because, God is always there. He is always, reaching out to everyone, but not everyone will have their eyes opened, and they may get they may get God reaching out to them and Him revealing Himself to them as He did you, but there are people that won't accept Him, and I think I was just sitting here thinking, thank God, Pete, that you accepted God in that moment. And then the window, then you went on to say the window where you saw the billion, and you knew that was the message, was that God was revealing Himself to a billion people. Gives me hope. You're 77 years old and you went through this problem, but this problem exists today. And I always tell people that times may change, but human behavior really does not change much. And we all want the same things. We all need the same things. We feel the same things. And our children are feeling the same thing, suffering the same thing, having the same questions that you had. And, all I want, as you want, is for all of them to know the truth and to have the same, never to have that drug experience in the first place. But if they do, to not end up in the pit, but to end up where you have ended up, and saying, yes to God when He gave you those signs and wonders and messages that you saw. So thank you so much for sharing, the story.
Yeah, I really like to say, that to focus in finishing, that it's not so much an event as a beginning. So this was my introduction to a relationship with Jesus. So that dynamic of me considering Him to be a historical figure changed to a living relationship with a person that's part of my life every day, every moment. And, that window that opened was Him showing me that's Him reaching out to a billion people across this earth to bring them into an encounter, not an experience like I had. Again, my experience was to give others hope. You don't need an experience like I had. You don't need to go through drugs. But it's to give others hope. And it's the beginning. It's not an event or an experience. It was the beginning of a relationship that is moment by moment. And God sent Jesus. He redeemed my life. I've had a new opportunity now. I have a family. I have 5 children. I have a bunch of grandchildren. I have a wonderful wife that's gone through 53 years with me to get us to this point. Thank God for her every day.
And I'm sure like you said, that peace that you felt was better than any high that you ever had. And that peace, I'm assuming, has continued because of that relationship that you have with Jesus. And
the peace continues, but let's be realistic. Your Christian life is a war. It's a battle. There are forces that come against us, and we all go through suffering. We'll all go through difficulties, but the difference is you don't go alone. You know where you're going when it's over. You've got help during the trials and difficulties. It's not a bed of roses. It's a challenge. Some people want a challenge. Well, buckle up. The Christian life is a challenge, but it's a wonderful challenge, and it's purposeful. It's meaningful, and the peace continues, and God's grace is sufficient. He's kept me. Many times I've reconsidered that vow. I'll live for you. I'll work where you want me to work. I'll do whatever you want me to do. Many times I've thought about bailing on that.
Because it's not easy at times.
Yeah, but he said, you ain't going nowhere. I got you. and I'm going to keep you. I went to a lot of trouble to get you,
Right.
and you're not getting out, so I don't want out.
And I know you've shared this story to many people over the years. In fact, I was quite moved. You said that you typed out your story and that you would actually stand outside Walmart stores and hand out your story to people. And I know that there's lives out there that your story has changed. I mean, I know they're there, and I guess when you get to heaven, you're gonna get to see the lives that you changed because of you being a witness and being willing to share your story. So, a smart man told me once that 80% of people have spiritual events, but only 20% are courageous enough to talk about them. So the fact that you're here today and, telling this very personal story that I'm sure there's some people out there that would say, well, it is the drugs or this or that,
Sure.
but you're courageous to tell your story, and I know the story is going to give hope to so many people and has changed lives, I'm sure, and will continue to do so. It reminds me of just a quick story that of another witness that I want to share, kind of the same theme. My high school friends, there's a group of 6 of us that have stayed extremely close. So a few years ago, we went on a girls' trip, and we went into the mountains and we went on a whitewater rafting trip. Well, the few days before we did the rafting trip, of the 6 of us, 4 had children that were abusing drugs and involved with drug use. And we were lamenting about this for 2 days, about, trying to talk to each other. Well, what are you doing? What have you tried? And just the troubles we had been having. And so anyway, we get on the boat, and our guide is this young 23-year-old boy who is our guide on the river. And we get to a calm spot, and he said, well, what do you ladies want to talk about? And we just kind of sat there for a moment. He said, well, let me tell you a little bit about myself. And he said, I just want to let you know that I used to use drugs. And he said, I was kind of the same thing you said. He said, I was the worst person you can imagine. I've used every drug out there. I've abused every drug. I've done every horrible thing that you can imagine. And he said, while I was in this life, he said, little did I know my mother was praying for me every night in a prayer journal. And she was writing everything that she was praying for about me. Little bits, it might just be something small. Help him do this. And he said that it took him years, but he had a very similar story. He said, God was calling me. He didn't tell us the specifics, but he said, God kept calling me. And he said, I finally accepted his call, and I accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior. And I turned away from drugs. And he said, when I turned my life around, he said, my mom handed me her spiritual journal. And she said, this is what I prayed for. I prayed for you that whole time. This was years. I mean, this was a journal. And he said he read through that, and he was amazed that the little things she prayed for about that time was when that prayer would get answered in his heart.
Absolutely.
And so he accepted Jesus Christ. He went back to college. He was in the process wanting to start a outdoor adventure camp for young people who are struggling with drug addiction, and was a witness. And we got out of the boat that day, and we got back into the bus, and one of the gals I'm with turns and says to all of us, we were meant to be on that boat today, because he gave us hope that as mothers we need to pray. He had no idea that 4 of the 6 women had children that were having drug issues.
That's awesome.
And it just reminded us all, we need to pray for our children. And that was a few years ago, and 2 of the 4 children no longer use drugs. So so prayer does work. And I think as a mother, and all the mothers out there, don't forget or give up on your children, and continue to pray that their eyes will be opened, those that are struggling with drug addiction, as your eyes were opened, and that they'll accept God's call to, return to that righteous.
Yeah, and if I
life.
could just say one more quick thing. You really triggered it. It seems like someone who had an experience like I had, where the light came on from heaven and all that. You would think you would have some kind of like special calling, or maybe start a church, and that's what I thought. But over time, God said, no, just an ordinary person. Just love the people that I give you to love. Just touch the lives that come across your path. You don't have to have a title. You don't have to be anybody. You're just, and again, to me, that just gives hope to everybody. I mean, we're all special. We don't have to have any credentials to go with that. We're special just because how much He loves each one of us,
Just love each person that you come.
Love each person that I give you,
A wonderful message, beautiful story. Thank you so much for being here and being, a guest. And like I said, I know you've changed lives, and you'll continue to change lives. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching Take a Deep Breath with us. If you haven't already, please like, comment, subscribe, and share below. For more episodes or to purchase my book, visit takeadeepbreathwithus.com. Thank you again, and please remember, no matter what you're going through, you can always take a deep breath, because truly, He holds us all in the palm of His hand.